Hello, everybody, and welcome to Critical Weight Theory. And this is another exciting edition of my Reply To series, where I respond to YouTube comments on my other episodes. So, the episode in question was titled More Right Wing Memes Equal Fake Quotes, Fake Rebels. So, in that episode, I looked at a fake Obama quote, the real history behind deportations and war powers, and why outrage is applied selectively. Then I took apart the Republican claims of being anti tax, showing how tax policy under Trump and the GOP actually protects wealth, expands patronage, and shifts the tax burden onto working people. So, somebody offered the following response to that episode in their YouTube comment, and I'd like to debunk it for you, my dear audience. So, at Louis Watson 9389 said in the comments section, but can you define what exactly is a woman? Can you do it without being excommunicated from your fellow comrades? And then there's a laughing emoji with, you know, implied goofiness and silliness and all that. So, my reply to that is relatively simple. For starters, that response has nothing to do with the episode itself. I was talking about fake political memes, fabricated quotes, tax policy, war powers, and Republican hypocrisy under Trump. And the commenter responds with, "What is a woman?" So that's a subject change. Clearly, it's not a counter argument of any kind, and there's no good reason to treat it as such because it's obviously not relevant. So when someone can't defend the claims being criticized, they try to drag the conversation into a culture war test they think will trigger outrage or score points with their side. So that alone tells you something. The whole define a woman thing is being used as a loyalty test, not a serious question. This line isn't asked in good faith, it's an attempt to participate in a meme. The goal is not clarity, the goal is to force a weird soundbite, frame disagreement as heresy of some kind, and suggest that anyone who doesn't repeat a specific phrase is controlled by a mob. So that's ironic given the episode that I posted is about manufactured outrage and performative rebellion. So, in reality, here's another kicker here. The answer to that question is itself not mysterious. If someone actually wanted an answer, it's easy to give one without drama or without, any sort of political screaming match or anything like that. So here it is. A woman is an adult human whose gender identity is female. Biology describes sex traits, society describes gender roles. They overlap often, but not always. And that definition is boring, functional, and widely used in medicine, law, and quite often daily life. The reason it's treated as forbidden by some is because outrage is more useful than accuracy. That's not a complicated question, but they don't like that answer because not only is it accurate, but it proves that there's relatively little controversy. You can have trans women in existence and still have, non trans women. It's not an either or sort of conversation. And in fact, even when it comes to things like, the theory that trans women are ruining sports, well, first of all, they're not exactly doing that. Plus, if you want sports, like if you're that concerned about it, you can still have sports without being concerned about gender identity or what's in between a person's legs. Sports can be separated by different, I guess, leagues, you might call them, right? You could have an entry level sports team, like, and then you could have the different athletes who are more skilled be in the more advanced league of that given sport. And if it's, if it's done right, you don't need to look at what's between a person's legs. You can have it divided based on a person's ability and their achievement level. So you don't even need to take gender or sex into account at all. You can just take how qualified they are. And that would be more fair. It would get rid of the gender antagonism or the sex antagonism, and it would actually be more about good sportsmanship. So that's the solution to that particular little problem. If you really want to find an answer, that's it right there. I don't often hear people advance that idea, but I think it would actually be valid. I'm not that much of a sports fan myself, so I'm not that quick to get into arguments about that, but that would be the actual answer to that particular supposed controversy. So, the excommunicated by your comrades line is more projection. Republican politics today is built on strict ideological enforcement. Step out of line on Trump, you're a traitor. Acknowledge nuance, you're woke. And oh, heaven forbid you're deemed as woke. There's no escaping from that. There's no step ladder out of that pit. But actually, there is. All you have to do is just not care about that particular label because it's essentially meaningless anyway. And if you question tax cuts for the wealthy, you're a socialist or a communist or some other boogeyman that is supposed to be scary. But of course, you could be against tax cuts for the wealthy without necessarily reading Karl Marx. You could have criticisms of capitalism in general without being Joseph Stalin. You know, there is a point in the middle between being a stark raving mad capitalist slash fascist and a stark raving mad socialist or far leftist and authoritarian leader. You don't have to be a communist or a capitalist in order to understand and critique the system, man. You don't need to like open up the capitalist or the communist manifesto. I was going to call it the capitalist manifesto, but the communist manifesto in order to actually critique some aspects of the capitalist system. For example, let's say you fundamentally don't like the idea that money should be the primary aim in life. Well, you don't necessarily need to read Karl Marx to have that sort of feeling. Even though it kind of is a sentiment that has some communist elements to it. But it could just be that you're a down to earth person that doesn't like the way that money dominates human life. You don't like class distinction that much. You just want to perhaps lead a relatively normal life and not have it be dominated by class division and various hierarchies in society. Maybe you just want to have a relatively peaceful world that's not divided so much. Does that necessarily mean you're a lunatic? I don't know. To me, it sounds relatively normal. And you don't need to be, again, Joseph Stalin or anything like that in order to have those feelings and thoughts. So, meanwhile, the left argues with itself constantly in public and loudly when it comes to a lot of issues, but the right, it is increasingly just a Trump cult. And we're seeing that in a lot of these YouTube comments. So the accusation of enforced conformity happening on the left is more projection. it's not really that accurate of an observation. And most important, the post avoids the actual criticism. Notice what the commenter does not address: the Obama quote of actually being fake. Now, there's another comment that I'll probably reply to in more depth in the future, in a future installment of this little show within a show, and that one says that, oh, there's no one out there who would actually think that that Obama quote was real. And you know what? If you don't think that Obama quote could be mistaken for a real quote, well, I think you are potentially dumber than a person who would mistake that for a real quote. I know that's a little bit of a convoluted sentence I just made there, but it makes sense if you actually think about it. So there's also the lie in that original meme that I was talking about, which is claiming that Obama was deporting Americans. Well, no, Americans were not deported under Obama. In fact, they're actually being more likely to be deported under Donald Trump because Donald Trump is basically throwing out the rule book, and you have more chances of people being wrongly deported, or if you want, just kidnapped and kicked out of the country for no reason because there isn't proper due process. And that is something that Trump has been more likely to make a reality than Obama. And of course, you've got the fact that Trump didn't reduce war powers or corruption. I brought that up in that other video. And the reality that Republicans are not actually anti tax, just anti progressive tax, even though they act like they're anti tax rebels. No, they just want to shift the tax burden. So this response was just asking an unrelated culture war question in a way to avoid all that because those issues are maybe a little bit too daunting, and it actually requires a little bit more substance and original thought to actually address what I was saying there. So the comment isn't a challenge to my argument, it's an escape hatch or an attempted escape hatch. So when people abandon the topic, reach for a weird meme that's completely irrelevant, and laugh instead of responding, it really means they don't have an answer to what I actually said. So I would say nice try, but it was actually a pathetic try. And, you know, you should try harder next time. Actually address something raised in the video that you are attempting to respond to.